The Marlins just barely missed making the playoffs here in 2024, yet the show goes on. Welcome to the official show here on the Fish on First podcast channel. I, of course, Ely Sussman, still here with you, bringing you all your Miami Marlins coverage all year round, fishonfirst.com. Despite being so far removed from the playoff picture this year, the Marlins very much in the news this past week for wholesale changes they're being made to so many different departments of this organization. I wanted to get some perspective on all those changes from somebody that was part of those changes. An outgoing analytics guy, Bradley Woodrum, right here, recently unemployed after being with the Marlins for parts of 7 seasons. Most recently, let me get this right, the coordinator of baseball information services. And we're recording this right before Hurricane Milton makes its impact. So we're going to try to be concise about here. And for anybody watching or listening to this, hoping that all goes well through the storm on your end and specifically on Brad's end right here. I appreciate you so much making the time to join us and to just give us your perspective on being with the Marlins for so long.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah. So I guess my high level resume is that I was spending my evenings as a baseball writer before being hired by the Marlins. And I was writing for Fangraphs, doing research for MLB trade rumors, and I saw an opening with the Marlins, and so I joined back in 2018, and it was a wild ride. Honestly, I have no regrets. I feel like the frustrations I have are more like I wish we had performed better while I was there. And in terms of the work ethic that I saw from everybody involved, it's a difficult industry. By design, everybody's trying their absolute best and everybody's hungry, and there's a lot of intelligent, hardworking people on every team. And so, but yeah, definitely it's been a tough week or two now. We've seen a great deal of turnover with the Marlins. And I'm one of those folks who has endured the turnover, but I'm super grateful to be on this podcast, by the way, as somebody who for 7 years was a fan of the podcast. I really enjoyed the content that you guys created. And I think Ely, you've been a fantastic voice of reason in times when it felt like maybe the national media was a little more uninformed or quick to judge on some things that we were doing our best on. So I really appreciate the effort that you have put into these past 7 years. Absolutely.
Oh, well, thank you. And I've been aware of you, Brad, for quite a while now, but on your way out, this Reddit AMA discussing your time in reaction to our own Isaac Azut, kind of talking about how all the changes that were being made, you put yourself out there in this AMA that touches on a lot of the topics we'll be going into here about your time and your experience with certain people with this Marlins organization. And you were clear, just as you are now in this AMA, that you had a good experience with the team. If anybody out there listening had a different experience working with the Marlins and they want to discuss it with us, I would just want to get everybody's perspective on this. So those people are welcome to reach out to me separately, but this is about your experience in analytics and with this team for parts of 7 years across several different baseball operations administrations right here. And I'm going to link this in the description for people that haven't read it themselves. If they want some separate conversations and exchanges, we'll make that available to you right here. But I want to get into stuff that I think specifically for our audience is going to be really interesting. You touched on it already in that very general intro about getting hired in the first place. There are no doubt a lot of people watching this, especially if they're Marlins fans, that are interested in getting a job in baseball, perhaps specifically with the Marlins. If you could get into a little bit more about why it is that you were interested in that Marlins opening specifically. What was that job opening at the time? Because you were around a while, that maybe your role has changed quite a bit. If you could just get a little bit more specific in terms of why you think they actually hired you in the first place back then.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And I know that's one of the questions I get the most consistently is like, how do I break into the industry? How do I get the job that you had, Bradley? And the truth is like everybody's journey is going to be their own. And so it's worth knowing where your skill sets lay, what, you can bring to a table to help a club out. What I was doing specifically may not be of interest to a club for the next 5-6 years, or like maybe they've got somebody in place. But if you have a skill set that they don't have, then you don't want to try to replicate what I did. But that said, I graduated with an economics degree, but also a creative writing degree. I have a master's degree in both of those fields. And it was one of those spaces where I felt like there was an intersection of both analytics work and communication that I could bring to a club. and it was something I had been doing in the public space. When I was originally hired by the Marlins, I was brought in to help expand a analytics department that I think was like 2 to 3 people strong. So like it was a really small, undersized department. And by the time I left, the department had like 7 folks working in Miami and then another like 7 working outside Miami, with them doing a lot more hires, bringing in more folks. Now, granted, obviously there's been turnover and that number is going to fluctuate, but I think the ambition now is to get it closer to a 20 to 40 type person department, which honestly, that in my opinion, like it's what we'd been asking for years, because we were wearing a lot of different hats. My title, coordinator of baseball information services, was something that we kind of worked on to invent something to better encapsulate what I was doing, because I wasn't doing just the normal work of a senior analyst. I was working in Tableau as the lead Tableau developer to create visualizations that was feeding into reports that went to executives, advanced documents that went to coaches and players, as well as just internal tools that we were using to help write analysis on players as well. So obviously, like, each club's got their own mindset. Each club has their own design for that department. And so what your skill sets might be, maybe you are a database engineer, or maybe you are somebody who likes to write up reports or something like that. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a skill that a club's going to need. It may mean actually it's a skill that they really need, but you want to lean into the things that you like to do. Like if you're doing something you don't like to do, that's the thing. I got let go by the Marlins and immediately went right back to baseball analysis. Like I can't help myself. I love it. I have a YouTube channel. I've already posted a couple videos on there, and it's just like, if I wasn't doing this for the Marlins, I was going to be doing it in my free time anyway. That's what I was doing for the 10 years leading up to working for the Marlins. So you got to make sure you're pursuing that thing you like to do, because if you end up being successful, you're going to have a winner's curse if you're doing something you hate doing and you're successful and you actually get that job. So, but that said, all of that said, I interviewed, hundreds of candidates and reviewed over 1,500 resumes by my last count while I was with the Marlins to help fill out positions. My experience was limited to what it is like working for the Marlins, right? I don't know what the Yankees hiring process is or what the Rays do. I know what the Marlins were doing for those 7 years. And I also know what kind of resumes I saw a lot in that period of time. So I think that can be helpful information. And what I saw is there's a lot of folks coming from college who don't have necessarily a portfolio of their work built up. And I know that, like, that sucks when you need to build up a portfolio of work that might be like a bunch of free work you're doing. But even just creating a blog that's got 2 readers on it, 3 readers, it doesn't really matter. If you're creating a body of work to show that you can do baseball analysis, to show that you know how to code in Python or R, that's going to be very valuable in separating your resume out from other candidates' resumes. So I'm sorry, I can really diatribe here. I don't mean to run off the rails here, but I will say that when I first came to the club, I was hired as an analyst. And at that point, I had already been a baseball writer for 10 years. I had just published some Tommy John research, a second revision of it on MLB Trade Rumors, which is incredibly prestigious location to be publishing research in the first place. It's an incredibly high traffic baseball website. And it was a research project that used machine learning algorithms to try to predict the next case of a Tommy John surgery. So like that kind of research in the public space, obviously, when you're doing it in that public of a space, you get a lot of criticism and feedback, which can be really helpful to make you better or really hurtful to make you give up on everything. But thankfully, I had a lot of positive feedback, and that made it so that when I applied to the Marlins, they knew who I was. And even folks who have really small blogs, you'd be surprised who that 2-person readership is. It might actually be an executive. Like I myself was visiting really small blogs. If they were writing about the Marlins, I was intrigued to know, why did they think Tim Anderson was struggling? Why did they think Jesus Sanchez's batted ball metrics were different from the on-field performance? Like that kind of information, we are searching it out. We're constantly digging into it. And yeah, you can see the article here that predicting Tommy John surgeries, it was a really difficult task. I don't think I actually fully answered the question there, but at the same time, I was able to demonstrate I knew how to code in R, I knew how to do machine learning algorithms, and I knew how to write up those reports in a way that could be understood by a general population, because the readership of MLB Trade Rumors, that ranges a broad spectrum of baseball fans. So I always encourage folks, encourage them to build out that portfolio. Show us what you can do. Maybe that's a GitHub. Maybe that's a personal blog. Maybe it's a YouTube channel. It doesn't really necessarily matter what you ultimately make, as long as it's something you're enjoying to do. you're going to find that eventually success can flow out of that space. All right. The original question, I can't even remember what it was, but I'm just going to diatribe for one more second here. And that is one of the big problems with the industry, and something that very much frustrated me, is there is a significant pay gap between what teams are willing to pay people and what skill sets might actually demand. If you are wanting to work in baseball, you need to recognize that there is a 50 to 75% discount on what you're actually worth to the market in terms of your skill sets. I was working as an economist for the Air Force, and I'm just going to divulge my salaries here, and I hope that's helpful to folks. And I hope they also keep in mind this is from 2017, 2018 kind of timeline, so the inflation and whatnot has changed these numbers. But I was making $70,000 as a economist for the Air Force, and I was working as a filthy government contractor. But when I was hired by the Marlins, I had to take a 50% pay cut. They paid me $35K to work as an analyst. That's actually better than a lot of entry-level pay rates. Most entry-level folks are coming in as a minimum wage intern. I personally find that to be like morally problematic. This is a multi-million-dollar industry, a multi-billion-dollar industry, paying folks minimum wage and asking them to work. And the expectation is you're working weekends, you're working 70 to 100 hours a week. I was brought in at $35K. I made it clear to them initially, like I have a wife and a kid. Like I can't survive at this pay rate for a long time. So they were able to get me to $70K as a senior analyst. And then from my second year with the club to the 2 weeks ago when they let me go, I only went from $70K to $92K. My promotion to coordinator of baseball information services was a promotion in name only. I got no pay raise with it. And that said, that $92K that I was making by the end there meant that my salary was worth 3-ish interns. So It is one of those tough things that the industry, we get within the first 72 hours of any opening that we posted, we got over 300 applications. And so if you want to work in baseball, make sure you're applying in the first 24 hours. Keep an eye on all the openings that are out there, but also just be aware that like your expectation for income needs to be on the floor, because if I didn't have a wife who was able to support me as I was working as a baseball analyst, I don't know if we would have been able to make things work as neatly as, because these jobs take place in major metropolitan cities. It tends to be very expensive to live in those locations. I'm sure my family out in Mississippi, hearing me making $35K sounds great, but like in Jupiter, Florida, where I was living, it's an incredibly expensive area. When we left Jupiter, we sold our house for more money than we can afford to buy it back. So like it's just, that's the nature of the industry. So I can't remember what the original question is, and I apologize for going on a long rant, but that's something I really want to get out there. I'm a big believer in labor rights, and I'm a big believer in the labor not having enough power in this situation. So I want to empower folks by letting them know what I made and what that looks like to get into that industry.
Right. And as best you can understand that, you don't feel that this is a Marlins specific problem, that across baseball, that this is just the reality because of the leverage that these teams have and all the
I've heard that
demands that people have to work in.
I've heard that some teams pay more than others. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But it is a matter of, like, again, of those 300 applications that we would get in the first 72 hours, the majority of them were people who were actually overqualified. And I've had folks reach out to me who got to like the final stages of the interview, and they're like, hey, why didn't I get hired? And first of all, I wasn't able to really say a lot of specifics. But secondly, the real reason most of the time was like, we're splitting hairs. You're all super overqualified for any opening that we're hiring. We often got college professors, people with PhDs, known baseball bloggers, known baseball writers applying to internship level positions. And so when the industry has that much demand to work in it, they know they don't have to pay a lot of people. And I've heard it said too, and I don't agree with this personally, but I've heard it said that like you want to pay them little so that you end up filtering down to just the people who really want to work in baseball. And I would hope that like anybody who's applying is already like really eager to work in baseball. There are times where I think the business side of a baseball organization can be more like a job to folks, whereas the baseball operations, because each club is split into like two major silos: baseball ops and business ops. Business ops sells tickets and billboards, and they do a lot of like the keeping the lights on kind of work. Baseball ops is all about making a winning team. People who work in baseball ops, they're living their dream. I was in the major leagues of my career field for 7 years, and I think that's pretty legit. I'm super happy that I got that experience. for people working on the business ops side, I mean, a lot of those folks, they got a business degree. Maybe baseball isn't their passion, and that's fine. Like, they don't have to. So it's a different it's a duality within the organization sometimes. And I've heard that's a truism across the sport. But for folks in baseball ops, it has to be your passion, because the expectations are so extreme in terms of the amount of hours you're going to commit to it, in terms of your knowledge of the game and your ability to like watch every single game and continue to learn and adapt. And if you're not hungry for it, for the time that you're working for the club, you end up burning out. And I will say, for 7 years, I didn't work a day in my life, even though I was spending over 100 hours a week, working. So it's tough, because like I loved what I did, but at the same time, I also recognized that like that's what made me somewhat replaceable. There's a lot of people who want to do this, who love to do this. And I think they're looking to realign a lot of the skill sets that are within that analytics department. So it resulted, unfortunately, in a lot of turnover.
We're with Bradley Woodrum, formerly of the Marlins, and he's already given me so much. You've already picked apart so many of the items that I had spread out like across to discuss in one fell swoop. So you've been at the same time long-winded, but also extremely efficient in touching on things that I think people really care about and are interested in. I did want to get your take on some individual people that you corresponded with. Being in baseball ops,
Mm-hmm.
There were several different changes during the course of your time there, starting with initially was Michael Hill, who was the president of baseball operations at the time, for those first 3 years or so with the organization. And he's somebody that comes from primarily a scouting background. I'm just curious, one at a time, from him to Kim Eng to Peter Bendix, what sort of interactions did you have with him those first few years with the organization? Who exactly did you work closely with, and who did you report to? What exactly was the job as an analyst in what you were doing? But of course, as you already touched on, having responsibilities beyond that. What was that like initially for a department when the department was still very small?
So yeah, I would say that for 6 of my 7 years, it was an incredibly small department. In the final year, it did balloon up, and I ended up with quite a few direct reports, which was really awesome. Finally, we were able to like do some stuff in the player development space, specifically where I was focused in on, that we couldn't have done in the past because I was spread so thin. But like, because of those 6 years with a smaller department, like we all wore many hats. We worked with a lot of different folks. I worked a lot with, not a lot. I worked with Mr. Hill on various projects. I was one of the analysts. Actually, I was the analyst who was doing analysis of what moving the outfield walls might result in our hopes of improving the offensive situation in Lone Depot Park. We considered things like moving home plate further out as well. And, I think the cost situation of that, like moving the actual foul poles, was too prohibitive. And honestly, creating that much foul territory behind home plate would have also had a potentially negligible impact on the offense, because you get home runs a little bit closer, but you end up with a lot more pop outs. Anyway, that's a totally another. I will get absent-minded professor really quick, so I apologize. That said, Michael Hill, I really love Michael Hill. He's a fantastic thinker. He's an exceptional negotiator, and just like there are personality types that I came to kind of associate with general manager hobo types, and Kim, and Peter are all cut from a very similar cloth. They're very even keeled. They're thoughtful. They're patient. And I think that kind of mentality is really essential. I can only think of, like, I've sat in on a number of calls. To my estimation, only Alex Anthopoulos seems like the high energy GM. Everybody else seems to be really in that same sort of zone of like even keeled, thoughtful, patient. And, there's a lot of lawyers in that space who know how to be careful in negotiation. And so Michael Hill, incredibly smart guy. I think one of the great frustrations was that we multiple times during my tenure lost, I think, some exceptionally talented folks. Michael Hill, Kim being a big notable one as well. And the organization obviously wanted her back, but obviously in a different capacity, and that wasn't the right fit. But so yeah, I think with Hill, and honestly with Kim, there was a mindset, especially as it pertained to my department, that analytics was one of the tools we're going to take into battle with us. It was one of the pieces to the puzzle. And I think the big paradigm shift, and the thing that ultimately maybe resulted in the rift that developed between Derek and the other owners, was there was a desire to develop analytics not as a tool, but as the glue that held everything together. And I'll be honest, like, I'm sympathetic to that mindset. I think that's why I really have high hopes for where the Marlins are still going, even though they're going to be unfortunately going without me. But I think Peter really sees analytics as this unifying force that is ingesting scouting reports, is ingesting reports from the coaches, is ingesting data in a way that then becomes actionable. And, not to get like history lesson on this, but like Branch Rickey is arguably like the original Analyst general manager. He is the general manager for many of the historical franchises that were so great, the Gas House Gang, Cardinals, the Brooklyn Dodgers when Jackie Robinson integrated. And I think it's important to know that Branch Rickey was using on base percentage. He was using scouting reports. He's the one who invented the 2080 scale. That mindset of saying, hey, there's information out there. How do I bring it together? How do I combine it? And I think that's the direction Peter's going with this, is he wants to take information from every absolute possible location, assimilate it all, and that take that assimilation and then apply it in a way that's actionable, effective. That mentality takes analytics from being a tool chest, a voice in the room, to being the power, that the actual process that brings that information together in a way that combines it, assesses the validity and impact of each of those different pieces of information, and then applies it in a way that's meaningful. So that like, I don't know if that sounds too nuancy, but like that's the difference that I saw. It's not that Kim and Mr. Hill or Derek didn't use analytics at their disposal. Like we created a ton of analytics tools that, Mel was using analytics to help create Cy Young pitchers. Like it was very much a piece of the puzzle for all those years. But that paradigm shift also comes with sort of a different expectation in staffing. And I think one of the things that Kim had said to me even directly is, like, the idea is having a smaller, more lean front office makes sense because it can help, coalesce that decision-making power, which I think there is some truth to that. But there's also like the flip side of that coin. And like, there was just so many projects we couldn't get done because we just didn't have enough staffing. And right. While it was great that I had a finger on the pulse of a lot of different projects, I had the ability to weigh in on things that would have been normally out of my scope in a larger analytics department. It also meant that like there were just so many things that coaches would ask us for, that scouts would want, that players could use, that we just simply didn't have time to build out. So we had to build the essentials, which was great because then you like really you do that process of thinking through what is essential, what isn't essential. And we for many years operated on a lean analytics department relative to the league. We were one of the smallest ones in the league, but we were punching above our weight. That's everything we heard from any player that we brought in from another organization is, wow, you guys' stuff is as good or better than this other analytically leaning organization I just came from. And that we took pride in that as our department. Like we recognized we were 7 strong, but we were going to make it, work. We were going to over leverage our abilities here. And we did. But at the same time, we also like couldn't embed analysts at AAA and AA and high A, like a lot of other clubs are starting to do. We had video managers at those levels, but we didn't have an analyst who could sit and talk through TrackMan data or pitch shapes with a pitcher or plate approach with a hitter. And this last year we did. And I think that's part of what Peter's doing. He's helping flesh out. I mean, one of the greatest frustrations that I myself had, and I think anybody who worked with this club in this last 7 years would echo, is that we didn't develop hitters. It was really frustrating. We spent twice as much in the draft on position players than we did on pitchers. And yet our draft products that kept making the majors was Nick Fortes and a bunch of pitchers. And the same was happening in the international space too. And so that degree of frustration was real. And it was real inside the org, even probably more so than publicly was being talked about. But at the same time, like it also is, it's frustrating to look around the league and see Stone Garrett, JJ Bleday, other players, position players who were in our system, who started to come up with us, and then ended up having success elsewhere, in part because maybe we pulled the trigger on getting a little too scared away too early, but also in part because like I think we lacked the resources in the player development pipeline to really affect the changes that we wanted. I think there was also maybe to a degree an overly optimistic hope that we can improve strikeout rates in the minors, and that was something we had really hoped was possible, and it would have made the difference with Monte Harrison and Lewis Brinson. Those guys would have been absolute rock star superstars if we had just been able to get that ball and play a little bit more often for either of those guys. Isan Diaz is in that same bucket. But at the same time, those kinds of intellectual mistakes are very different from just not having enough manpower to affect the changes that we knew would make a difference for JJ Bleday. And so all that said, JJ's awesome, and I'm rooting for him a ton, and it's very fun to see his success with Oakland right now.
I think people listening to this are going to be pretty amazed by how similar your uh, the way that you process this stuff is so similar to the fans themselves in terms of taking notice of how other guys do once they lead the organization and having those exact
Oh,
same
absolutely.
concerns about like how close guys may have been to turning a corner here and what really was the
Mhm.
issue. And you already started off by kind of dispelling the myth that for all the money that the Marlins say they're investing internally, on an individual per analyst basis, that's kind of limited because they're able to get people at relatively cheap salaries compared to other
Yeah.
industries. But what other ways would you be able to spend money on analytics or spend money as an organization in ways that would either catch up to other teams or surpass other teams? Is it what kind of technology did you guys want that could have maybe made a difference aside from just hiring more and more
Yeah.
people at entry level positions? How exactly do you think money could be put to effective use in a way that it wasn't, at least in previous years prior to Bendix coming in here?
I think that's a fantastic question, and I want to also emphasize too that one of the frustrations that was happening on the inside is that like there was so much talked about our payroll, especially in those early years, 18 and 19, when like we had the money from Chin-Ming Wang's contract on the payroll. We had Martin Prado money still going out, and folks didn't realize that the payout structures of those might have been slightly different than what was being talked about, and we were still paying into that money well beyond the time people were talking about it. And the reality is that yeah, that's dead money, and dead money means that player's not on the field, but it's still money. Like it's money that the club had to pay. And so that really hemmed us in significantly in terms of what we could actually put in terms of payroll onto the field. But one of my very first projects for the club was to build out an analysis of how much return on investment is there in spending a lot on the draft. The previous ownership group was not very interested in maxing out their draft budget, but Derek wanted to see a research project on that. And so I like went into Derek's office up in Lone Depot Park, sat up there with my boss, and we talked through the expected wins above replacement for high school players taken at X level within the draft. And, my research ultimately led us to maxing out spending money on Connor Scott and Nasim Nunez and Osiris Johnson, guys, unfortunately, many of whom didn't actually pan out for us, but willingness to spend in that space is an incredibly meaningful. The return on investment for in the both the domestic draft and the international space is so disproportionately high relative to the free agent market. The free agent market, your return on investment is actually like for every dollar you spend, you tend to get like 75 cents of value. But in the draft, every dollar you spend, it tends to be closer to like $10 of value. And in the international space, every dollar you spend is close to $100 of value. So like there's an enormous return on investment. And personally, I think when you invest in analysts, when you invest in staff, the return on investment is like $1,000 per every dollar you spend, because it's such a significant impact through some, unfortunately, very lowly paid affiliate level analysts can do things that meaningfully impact your $1 million prospect in a way that turns them into a $10 million prospect. That's an incredibly valuable return on resources. That's why clubs that historically are small budget teams like the Tampa Bay Rays, they flesh out that minor league player development staff. They flesh out their analytics staff, because if you have enough people to check every box in terms of all the different research projects on your wish list, then you're going to be able to leverage that information in a way that the rest of the league isn't ready to do. And so I really, again, like I think that's what Peter is building. He's trying to replicate that mindset of we need to staff up as much as possible. There's an enormous return on investment in that staffing space. But that said, the Marlins, for the time I was there, meaningfully redirected resources to the international space, to the draft. And honestly, like Victor Mesa Jr. probably going to be in the majors next year. If I had to guess, it may not be with the Marlins, but I think the timeline is there, and he's incredibly talented. He's an exceptional young man. Like truly, like if you get a chance to meet him, he's the real deal.
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
that all that said, like that was because of money willingly invested in both him and his brother. And his brother, unfortunately, didn't work out. I think, obviously that story tells itself, but that's the risk that is incurred. And while that doesn't look great when somebody doesn't turn around and become a superstar, when you sign Ronald Acuna Jr. for $10,000 and he turns into Ronald Acuna Jr., that investment makes it worth all the $1 million investments you may have missed on earlier, because you've exhausted that market. You've done your best to bring in as many talented young folks as you can through that avenue. So that said, I wouldn't be surprised if I think the worst kept secret around the league is that an international draft is probably not too far away. And if that is the case, then that's going to have to continue to be a space where the Marlins find a way to bring money to bear in that space, because there's still a ton of value out there. And if an international draft ends up affecting things like KBO and NBP players, we're going to be talking about like major league ready players potentially available if a team is willing to spend on that signing bonus. And so I think the Marlins, in my time there, began to redirect those resources. Historically, the Wayne Huizinga and the Loria regimes, they were more interested in beefing up that major league roster, and they never built that underlying core of talent in the minor leagues. You need that pipeline of talent. You look at where the Marlins farm system ranked in circa 2019, and it was a decently ranked farm system. And where did we end up in 2020? Well, we ended up in the playoffs. Where did we end up in 2022 playoffs? That is not a coincidence. Historically speaking, and this is Analyst work in the public space has confirmed this for years, that when you build up a farm system that's ranked in the like top 10 or even just like top 15, your odds of making playoff runs massively increase, because no roster is truly 40 persons deep, and the Marlins really proved it this year. And when you cross that 70 player boundary, you're really proving the point that you need a lot of depth for any club to work in. You can't build that depth just with free agent signings, whether it be minor league free agent or major league free agent. You've got to find a way to build a pipeline of talent up to that minor league system. So I can't remember what the original question was, but hopefully somewhere along there I answered it.
Yeah, and honestly, it's irrefutable that the team did a better job at maximizing what they could spend in those amateur spaces in recent years. For people unfamiliar with the draft bonus pool, not only 100% of your bonus pool, but there's a 5% overage you can spend. And there were several years recently where the Marlins did spend basically every cent that they could in order to piece together those classes with as much talent as they felt was available. And same internationally. I think as of just a few days ago, they reached another deal with an international free agent that soaked up most of the money that they had remaining in their current bonus pool for this year. The money that in both cases, you either use it or you lose it, or you use it or the ownership pockets it. And in this case, they've actually been using it. So the results themselves may take a little bit longer to pan out just because of how young those guys are when they enter pro baseball in the first place. That has been something that has been really observable, at least from my end, that's been different. And I'm glad to see that that was done actually as there was a process in order to arrive at that conclusion for them to do things a little bit differently than had been done previously. I did want to get your take on a couple other characters that are still with the organization right now that came up in that Reddit AMA that you did recently. One of them being Gabe Kapler, mentioning in a reply to somebody that I friggin' love Gabe. And there are a lot of people from afar, a lot of heterosexual women who might agree that he's a very attractive man. But I think you meant this in a baseball sense, a baseball operations sense. He's the assistant general manager for the Marlins right now, by all accounts staying on for a second year under Peter Bendix. Just curious about what your interactions with Gabe have been like and why it is that you feel very strongly about his future as a front office guy.
Yeah, so I got to work with Gabe a good amount while I was there, and obviously our time didn't intersect for very long, but for this last year, I was working a lot in the player development space, and that's where he was primarily leveraging his ability as well. So I got to work with him and Rachel, and Gabe is just genuinely like, he's an intelligent, friendly dude. He's easy to talk to. He's played the game. He's played at the highest levels. He is or was a fantastic ball player, and he's got a great mind for looking for what's next. And I think he's a creative thinker who, honestly, his time in the managerial space, he showed that off a little bit. But I think there's a lot more ways you can be creative in a front office capacity than you can as a manager on the ball field. That's a space that's been really publicly explored for 150 years, because people see what you're doing as a manager on the field. But when you talk about what happens behind closed doors in a front office capacity, that's a lot more unknown. We don't know exactly how other clubs are operating. So creativity really pays dividends in that space. And I think he's an exceptionally creative guy, and he's open to new ideas. So really loved working with Gabe. I think he's got exciting possibilities for the Marlins in the future. And I think him also working with Rachel, who sees no boundaries. Like she truly just is happy to hire a hitting coach who has no hitting coach experience, but who is a creative thinker, or who brings a dynamic that, you know, no other club has. Like that kind of mindset. That's how you get the most out of every person on your staff, is bringing in folks who really do break the expectations of what you think is possible. So, yeah, I think Gabe is fantastic, and I really, I'm bummed I didn't get to work with him more this coming season, because, you know, he's got that same demeanor that a lot of general manager, president of baseball operation folks do, where he's absorbing opinions, he is thoughtful, he's again like thinking through problems from different directions, and I really appreciate that. You know, I don't know what the long-term future is. I know he's part of the more recent group of hires, so I'm going to guess he's going to be with the Marlins for quite some time, but I wouldn't be surprised if another club comes knocking on that door fairly soon, because he was absolutely making waves immediately within that player development side of things.
Another name that came up that is much less recognizable to the general fan base is this person, for people watching on YouTube. That is David Ott, who is one of the minority owners of the Marlins. For people that aren't familiar, Bruce Sherman, he is the principal owner. He is the chairman. He is the decision maker. He's not the only one that is invested in this team. David Ott, by some calculations, might even have more resources from his previous careers in order to invest in this team. It owns a chunk of it. I believe his title might be director of the Marlins, something like that. But he came up in that AMA as somebody that you feel is very intelligent and analytics savvy. And I don't think people realize that he had any sort of hands-on involvement with this team, but apparently he does. So if you can fill us in terms of what you got to know about David Ott moving forward and what he does that people might not be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope David doesn't get upset about me talking about, I think he does like to play a bit more in the shadows, but I know in the last year or two, he did start to come out. Obviously you can see him in the screenshot. He's on the Blue Wahoo's broadcast there. David was part of the ownership group that took over in 2018. He is the second largest owner of the club. He comes from a background in finance, and he is very much he strikes me having a conversation. It's like talking to an old economics professor. Not to say he's old, but like one of my previous economics professors. It's just really a fantastic, thoughtful mind. And he has been leveraging his own expertise within the analytics space since day one. He has been directly involved in some of the projects that we were working on. He was weighing in a lot on like surplus values calculations. And that was a project that I had been running up with the idea of like, how much more valuable is this player than their contract? Because that should determine how much you get in return for a trade. And his leverage, or his ability has been leveraged a bit more, I think, since Derek departed. And so if I had to guess, just kind of filling in the blanks, it does seem like maybe that was part of where that rift existed, whereas I think David is much more analytically inclined, incredibly analytics savvy owner, whereas I think Derek had a lot more of the mixed approach that is very successful for other organizations. I should emphasize that, like, the Yankees have an enormous analytics department, but they also see it maybe more as a tool, not necessarily a glue. And so David, however, I think he's much more in that space of like wanting to have analytics feed the decision process from the ground up. And I honestly, like, that's one of the reasons I think Marlins should have a lot of high hopes for the future for the club, is that David's an incredibly intelligent owner. And it's worth noting, Bruce is a Marlins fan. Like, he's an extremely passionate Marlins, like he's not just an owner who's here to make a buck. And I that is always one of the things that blows my mind. You watch any interview with like Bruce, he's just like, he's really adamant that he just wants the club to win. And I think he's willing to do whatever it takes. And David, it has that analytical mindset to, like, he knows what it takes. And so I think they actually make kind of a great pairing in that regard. And in all honesty, like, David's increased role with the organization, I think, is going to gel really well with Peter's approach to things too. And I think it having tension at that highest level is never a great thing. And I think that what we're seeing now is a lot more smoothing of that tension. So hopefully that yields benefits for the Marlins. Because I want to also just take a moment to say there are no greater fans on earth than Marlins fans. There are, like, and I mean that specifically to say, like, no fan. Are we allowed to swear on this podcast? What's the word?
Of course,
on that?
go ahead.
Okay,
Please
okay.
do.
No fan base has put up with more shit than Marlins fans. The simple matter of the fact is, if you still root for the Marlins after the club was sold off multiple times, after the stadium was built with malicious processes, after the frustration and anguish of seeing Derek depart, of seeing the team not fulfill expectations, and if you still root for the Marlins, you are truly one of the select excellent fans out there. You are truly a fanatic by definition. And so I just want to commend the Marlins fans who are listening to the podcast, who are just in general rooting for this club, because like I would go to those games and I would see fans out there cheering their lungs out, seventh inning of a game that like didn't frankly matter at all. And they're cheering as if it's the World Series. And yeah, I know the stadium's not jam-packed full, but those are like the real fans that are there right now. And one day I really do hope that stadium is going to be consistently packed. And when that is, I hope those fans take that as their just reward for those years of suffering, those years of torment, and sticking with it. I think we in the front office space, we recognize you guys are out there, and we can't you pay our salaries. So like we can't thank you enough. And I now as an unemployed person, I will say like, I still recognize that Marlin fan base is truly exceptional, and huge plaudits to you guys. I hate that the club has not loved you back, and that's the unfortunate thing about baseball. Is you can love it all you want, but it won't love you back. And I hope everybody continues to be in a healthy mind space, but at the same time, I think the plaudits are due for Marlins fans.
One more thing that I wanted to get you out on here, as you've referenced a couple of times, worked very directly with player development, and that is going to be the players that are in their system right now are going to be so crucial to how quickly that team returns to being competitive. Are there particular players that either broke out this year or ones that you think are on the verge of breaking out in 2025 and beyond? Are there particular guys that you are high on in this Marlins organization moving forward based on what you've been able to see from them firsthand and what you've been able to see underneath the hood?
I wish I had better news in terms of like the farm system as a whole. I think it was one of the things we recognized pretty early on, is that like we are not satisfied, or we weren't satisfied with the state of the farm system. And that was not a surprise to us. I mean, I think we could see this kind of developing when some of the higher draft pick prospects come. They don't hit the ground running. You don't trade a guy like Khalil Watson within 2 years of having drafted him, thinking it was this huge steal, if things are going great, right? And so unfortunately things did not go great in that space, but the byproduct of that is that it creates an opportunity for all the people who are in there to surprise us, the Jonah Brides to surprise us, to come out as a minor league free agent or to join the club via free agency or a trade and really make an impact in a way that's unexpected. I will say, for my personal opinion, and this is a guy I stuck my neck out for multiple times and doing different research projects on and working with, Griffin Conine defies all expectations. I really, also just for like the storybook aspect of it, I really hope this guy is who I think he can be. The power is obviously extremely legitimate, but also the person is somebody you can bet on. Like, it's somebody you can expect is going to do well. He's a hard worker. I remember one of my first interactions with him, I was walking up the batting cages and I just heard him speaking in Spanish to some of the players. And I was like, what the heck is going on here? Like, he's fluent in Spanish, absolutely fantastic human being. He's going to put in the effort to make it work. And he's a guy who has recognized that the strikeout rate was a problem in the minor leagues. And so he put in the work to make it better. And he's also a guy who is, that defense is going to sneak up on you. There's not a lot of arms like that in the minor leagues. Honestly, the only other arm I saw that was anything like that was Victor's arm. And honestly, it's not, center field defensive ability, but it's going to be a right field defense that you're going to be happy with for a decade. And so I really do hope that the needle is as pointed as high for him as I think it is. And with regards to Xavier Edwards, I think we might be looking at a superstar in the making. This guy is, from a wins above replacement perspective, I think he's going to be like a 5-win player, which is that's huge. I think he's a potential Ozzie Albies type player for the Marlins. And our internal metrics were a lot more optimistic of what can happen at shortstop. I think there's that's one of the divides between maybe what the scouting and sort of older school mindset would dictate. in terms of how arm strength really plays at shortstop. He's just got such fast hands, really great footwork that you can make up for a lot of sins with arm strength. Dansby Swanson keeps showing up as really weak arm strength for years, but he still was putting up excellent defensive run saves values. So like, I think it's a space where they're wanting to see if it's possible he can stick at shortstop. That's a huge boon to the club. I think there's other like role players like Otto Lopez and Bride, who I mentioned, who really could be quite useful long term. I think Lopez's defense at second is going to keep him in the league for a long time in some capacity, potentially as a starting second baseman. He strikes me as like Darwin Barney with a little power, which is that's a very potent looking player. But I think the elephant in the room is I've not named any minor leaguers. I think there's a hope that some of these new guys who've come in, who are boosting the system a little bit, are going to really develop into something very promising. But if there's not a lot of like slam dunk big names coming down the pipeline, and one of my sort of truisms is that like you tend to see hitting prospects far off. When Vladimir Guerrero Jr. was in rookie ball, it was kind of clear he was going to be a major leaguer. Juan Soto made the majors at 19. Michael Harris II comes up straight from AA. You can kind of see the hitters from afar off. Pitchers can appear out of nowhere. And that was something we made a good deal of cash off of, essentially. We were able to find pitchers who were on the cusp or who were there but didn't get like the proper credit, and we were able to leverage them into trades or into high leverage bullpen spots or make them starting pitchers even. So like you can have a guy like Brian Hoeing who switches to relief, adds 3 miles an hour, which is uncommon for a reliever to add 3 miles an hour to his fastball, or Cody Poteet showing up with 2 more miles an hour on his fastball. Like guys like that can kind of appear as pitchers, but on the position player side is a lot harder for them to just kind of appear out of nowhere. And so that's why I think losing Nasim Nunez really hurts. It was one that we were really hoping he wouldn't stick. What the Nationals have done to him this year is, I think, borderline amoral, but they certainly have paid him. So I'm happy for him in that regard. But at the same time, like we really didn't think any team had the gumption to take him and hold him for this long, because he simply is like, the hitting needs more work. And I honestly think he's another great guy. Like he's going to get there, and the defense is already major league quality. But like losing him for the Marlins was really tough, because especially since we weren't confident Xavier could fit at short, then like losing Nasim, who is absolutely a shortstop, means that you've just slimmed that depth even further in that space. So that said, I really do hope that the current minor league system for the Marlins has another like 4 or 5 major leaguers in it right now. There were some guys that our analysts were working with on a daily basis, really working on trying to find where that next breakthrough is. Jacob Berry is, the surface level numbers are not as exciting, and it's not what you would expect. Not, I think, what he expected, what we expected, taking him so high in the draft, but he really turned a corner mid-season. The analysts he was working with they were through the moon with what they were seeing. I have high hopes that there is a JJ Bleday type late bloom happening for him right now. And so I think there is a real possibility Jacob Berry is going to be a right fielder or first baseman for the Marlins in the future. I think third base might be a little too hard on our on blood pressure, but yeah. So I think there is absolutely some position player possibilities in the minors, but the club is really lacking those major prospects in the way that we tried to build that pipeline, but we failed. I mean, there's no 2 ways about it. I think we recognize that we were frustrated by that. Whereas on the pitching side, I think it continues to be a very exciting pipeline pitching wise. I think this is a year where multiple of our clubs had really great pitching staffs, and that was with Dax Fulton out for the whole season. That was with Evan Fitterer having issues when he got up to AAA. Like, I mean, there are still guys, there are major league quality pitchers in this system, and I can say that with a lot more confidence. And I think that has a lot to do with, again, unfortunately, these are, I'm not sure if Tommy's still with the club, but Tommy Phelps and Scott Aldred, our pitching coordinators with the club, were fantastic. They let Scott go, and I think he needs to catch on somewhere. Scott's fantastic. Tommy's fantastic. They're a big reason why our pipeline has been so successful at developing major league quality pitching. So I don't know, that hopefully that it continues. I honestly, you look at what the Rays do, and I don't think there's too much reason to doubt that's going to continue under Peter. I think there's an increased emphasis on the things that Scott and Tommy were doing successfully. So it only should get better from here. That's my hope. But again, I can't say for sure. I work in predictive analytics, but sadly, I'm not a true soothsayer.
Right. And that is going to be the essential question moving forward, where there's been so much change across so many different departments, including people that were doing their job well. And you, right at the end, mentioning that guys that were so crucial to this whole pitching development operation. Yeah. And even though there's going to be, you imagine, a good search to find replacements, and that Peter has a vision in mind for how this all fits together. And it's to make so much change is a pretty bold decision. Getting guys that are on their way out, they can't take it personally, and that includes you. I mean, by this conversation, this has really been incredible, Brad, to hear your perspective on these type of things. And no doubt, if you are still interested in working in baseball and still earning that fraction of what you might actually be worth in terms as an analyst, then I imagine there's going to be a whole lot of interest in what you have to do, because from you around the league and from other clubs. So I hope you enjoyed this downtime with your family. I hope everybody's safe during the course of the storm. This went way over our expected time, as you predicted it would. But at this point, you got to make sure that, at this point, you got to make sure that get out of the way of this upcoming storm. So I'm sure we could talk again in the future, because we could really go on all day about this type of stuff. This is really great insight in terms
absolutely.
of where this.
100%. And I will say, I want to just kind of to throw this out there too. If you are interested in working for the Marlins in the future, and you want to work specifically in the analytics department, I think one of the big pushes is they're trying to build up that R shiny skill set. So if you don't know how to code in R, the R programming language, please do dig into that, and develop a competency, develop an excellence with the R shiny program that's within the R programming language. So it's one of those spaces that I know, like, folks listening to this may be interested in working in analytics in the future, and they're going to be building up, like you said, like they got a lot of vacancies now. And so that's a skill set that I know they're eagerly hunting, and people who not just have the competency, but who excel in that space. So if you are one of those folks, like, build that portfolio, show it off, make sure that you're going to have it, because there's going to be postings here soon. So I would recommend folks keep an eye on that for sure.
Bradley Woodrum, former Marlins coordinator of baseball information services, thank you so much for hopping on the show to go through all that. Really learned a lot, and I'm sure people are going to appreciate listening to this.
Absolutely. I should also, oh my gosh, I'm so bad at this. I should plug something, right? I have a YouTube channel. It's under my name, Bradley Woodrum. I write, baseball scripts for that. So, check it out. I released a video on Monday morning. Nothing to do with the Marlins, but it's baseball intensive. And if you like hearing me rant, then you'll hear a little bit more of that with some charts and graphics and whatnot. So I thank you again, Eli, so much for letting me on here. I love talking baseball. Be happy to join anytime.
Yeah, so I'm excited to now watch you yourself as resuming your former career as a content creator and a public analyst. I think we're all better off having you now from out behind the curtain and being able to share some of your insights with the world again. So I'm looking forward to that. I'll be sure to plug that in the description here as well. So Ely Sussman here on the Fish on First podcast. Thanks everybody for listening. Season's over, but our work is just beginning. A whole lot of content coming at you throughout the entire year, covering our Marlins. Now the Bradley Woodrum-less Marlins, but there's still a team that I know you guys are very curious and following the rest of the way. So until the next time, keep up with the rest of our stuff, fishonfirst.com. We appreciate the support all year round from you Marlins fans out there. As always, go Fish.